Hi there, everybody. Delighted to welcome you to our eighth event in this series from the Children in Care Research Forum, and very excited to welcome my colleague, Dr. Eavan Brady, who will be our speaker today. Of course, she's also joint convener with myself, Robbie Gilligan, of the Research Forum, but today she's wearing two hats as a organizer and presenter. But before we go to the actual presentation, just a little bit of housekeeping. Some of it connected to the fact that we're living in this online world. We're all coping in our different ways with that, I hope. But it's a daily challenge. I think we all have to kind of go against our natural instinct in so many ways, dealing with technology and isolation and all these things. But anyway, so just practical points for your information. First of all, Eavan intends to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we would open the floor, so to speak, to questions and answers. So you're welcome to press the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter to type questions that may occur to you along the way, and we can go back to those later on. So if you want to, we won't interrupt the flow at that point, but we will capture your thoughts if you wish to have a question for consideration. The third thing is that we're in the world of social media as well, and if you wish to tweet about what you're hearing or your thoughts or reflections on the issues raised, please feel free to tweet and to use our hashtag. Of course, hashtags are very important in the world of Twitter. So hashtag Children in Care Research, to attach that to your tweet, will add to its impact. So thank you for that. If that is your wish to be active on Twitter today. The next point I'd like to make is to thank Trinity Research and Social Sciences, who are providing us with the technical support to host this event. It's an umbrella unit supporting social science research in Trinity, so we're part of that within the School of Social Work and Social Policy. We're delighted to have that support, and to particularly thank our colleague Maeve McGrath, who's gone above and beyond the call of duty in terms of providing support and a lot of kindness as well. So thank you, Maeve. The other point is that if you wish to be invited or informed of the next event, which there will be one, we expect a number, but certainly one after Christmas. If you send Eavan an email, her email address will be on her slides. So Eavan will be happy to record your name and address and ensure that you receive notice of the next event. So I think we're almost ready to go now in terms of that's all of the housekeeping. So I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Eavan Brady, Assistant Professor of Social Work and Director of the Master's in Social Work Programme in our School of Social Work and Social Policy here in Trinity College, Dublin. And she is going to present findings from her PhD study. The title is Exploring Educational Pathways of Care Experienced Adults. So I'm now going to hand over to Eavan in a seamless process, hopefully.
Beautiful. Thank you, Robbie. That was definitely seamless. I am going to share my screen, which also will hopefully be somewhat seamless. Thanks, Robbie, for the introduction. And I should also acknowledge that Robbie was my PhD supervisor, and an excellent one at that. So he also played a part in this study. So hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here and to be speaking about my PhD findings really for the first time, actually, since I officially finished my PhD. So this is an exciting moment for me and a little bit daunting. But I actually spoke about my PhD at the very first Children in Care Research Forum, which we had back in April 2017. And it was in a real live room with real live human beings there. And it was really a lovely experience, and there was so much support at that point. So This is kind of the other end of towards the end of the line of the project, I suppose. So what I'm going to do today is give you a sense of how I did my study and some of my key findings. And if I could just get there we go, getting my screen to move on. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background to the study and why I chose to do what I did. I'm going to give you a very, very kind of brief introduction to this life course perspective that I took to the study, I used when I was doing the study. Very briefly tell you about how I did it. And I'm going to spend most of my time then talking about some selected findings and the implications of the study. As you can probably imagine, 30 minutes doesn't feel like very long to talk about a study like this. So I've been quite selective in the information that I'm going to share. It's not to say that it's exhaustive or it's everything by any stretch, but I suppose I handpicked the things that I thought might be most interesting and useful for you guys to hear about. But if anyone wants to learn more, they're very welcome to contact me about that. Okay. So just to start by giving you a little bit of a background, and maybe there's some diehards here who were at the first presentation I gave at the first Children in Care Research Forum. I should say it's very exciting to be on our 8th research forum, actually. You know, I think it was something me and Robbie were really excited about and really committed to, and it's wonderful to see how it has kind of grown and evolved over the years, but also that it's sustained itself throughout kind of the COVID times, as often they're referred to. So just to acknowledge that. But just to go back to my study, so as Robbie said, it was a qualitative life course study of the educational pathways of adults who were in care as children. So I essentially gathered the educational stories of a group of adults who had spent time in care and left care and lived in Ireland. And I suppose the background to the study is kind of couched in a couple of specific points. So the first being that we know from, you know, a huge amount of general literature how important education is for promoting positive outcomes in adulthood in terms of, you know, well-being, mental health, employment, income, and all of that kind of thing. It's very well established in the literature. And yet there's also fairly substantial literature base pointing to the low educational attainment of young people who were in out-of-home care. And that's particularly true if you look at educational attainment in those initial years after leaving care. So if we look at what's happening for young people who've left care around the age of 18, 19, 20, 21, up to about 23 or 24, which is where a lot of studies on this topic focus. Broadly speaking, the education attainment of young people who've been in care tends to be lower than that of people who haven't been in care. And educational attainment in this context means the highest level of education achieved. I think we can all probably appreciate that education means lots of different things for lots of different people. So that's kind of in the ether of the study, I suppose, but I'm specifically talking about highest level of education achieved or attained. And I started to wonder, or one thing I wondered about was, I suppose, you know, what about the attainment and pathways through education of an older, and inverted commas are very important using that word, but an older care experienced population. So what happens if we look beyond that age of 24? And what happens if we look at the path that has been taken through education instead of looking at education at one point in time? And that was essentially kind of what I was trying to do with my study, was look at what happens if we consider educational outcomes, attainment, experiences a little bit later than we have been doing. What does that do? What does that mean in terms of what we know and how we understand educational experiences for people who've been in care? And partnered with that was this idea that I wanted to look at some of the factors that might have influenced those educational pathways over time. So these 2 points were the core aims of my PhD study. So to explore the educational pathways of adults who spent time in out-of-home care, and also then to examine some of those factors that influence these pathways over time. Obviously not looking at every single factor that could have influenced, but really I zoned in on a couple of specific factors when I was doing my analysis of my data. Just a little point on the Irish context, and I'm sure most, if not all, people here will probably be attuned to some of these points, but just to note that there is a very limited amount of data available on the educational outcomes of children in care and young people and adults who've been in care in Ireland. And I also just wanted to draw everyone's attention to this point around aftercare provision, because it's something I'm going to come back to when I talk about the implications of the study. So as some of you may be aware, the provision of aftercare can be extended up to the age of 23 if a young person is in full-time education or accredited training. And I'm going to maybe dig into that a little bit, or point out some other ways of thinking about that after I've presented some of the findings of my study. So you've that to look forward to. I just wanted to mention the life course perspective, which was kind of the framework that I applied to my study, and I think has a lot of merit when we're talking about education and educational pathways, and you know, the idea of lifelong learning and that kind of thing, because it's a framework. It's an interdisciplinary framework, first of all, but it also explores human lives and development from birth until death. So not just focusing on those early years, those adolescent years, but really looking at the entire life course and development across that whole period, or a person's whole life. And something that really, I think, is really critical to hold on to when we're talking about a topic like this is something that's central to the life course perspective. So that idea that the course of a person's development, offers opportunities for growth, development, and change on an ongoing basis. So it's not that opportunities to grow and develop and change end at a certain point. They're always there, and they can be found and can be nurtured. And I think that's a really central point when you're talking about education in general, and returning to education, but also when we're talking about that in the context of people who have care experience as well. Two last points there: that the life course perspective does consider and pays, due attention to the relationship between earlier experiences in terms of childhood and adolescence, and how those relate to later experiences in adulthood. So looking at those things that may play out over time. And it identifies the long-term role that those experiences can play in influencing pathways, and not necessarily in a deterministic sense, but just gives us a framework for considering and maybe unpicking and unpacking some of the ways that earlier experiences can and often do impact on our later lives in various ways. Okay. Just to give you a sense then of how I did my study before I tell you a bit about the people I spoke to and what I found. So use that life course perspective. I did educational life history interviews with people. So I essentially asked people to tell me about their educational story from their earliest memory up to present day. And I always feel like that's an interesting thing for anyone to think about. Where are you now and how did you get there is essentially what I was asking, specifically in the context of education. And, I would have asked some follow-up questions as well, and, had a bit of a conversation about various things that were mentioned, but that was the starting point for the interviews. And I spoke to 18 care experienced adults who were aged between 24 and 36, who would, generally speaking, spent at least 2 years in care. And something that I really wanted to do was talk to people who had had very different experiences in terms of education. And that was, I did that to a certain extent. And there were certain perspectives that I wasn't able to include in the study, and that's definitely a limitation of the study. But I was able to, include the stories of people who had left school early, who'd gone back to education, who had been out of education for a long time, and people who had left school and hadn't gone into further higher education, but interestingly had plans to. So I did my best to seek different educational stories, and was successful in that venture to some degree, but not entirely. So for example, I wasn't able to hear from anybody who had left school early and had never gone back to education and had no interest in returning to education, which is possibly because of the nature of the study. If I'm asking somebody about education, or if I'm seen to be wanting to hear about education, maybe people might not feel that they have much of a story to tell. So there's lots of things to unpack there from a methods perspective, but that is not for today. Don't worry, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But to tell you a little bit about the 18 people that so generously gave of their time and their stories to be a part of this study. As I said, there was 18 people altogether, 11 women and 7 men. 10 participants were in the age group 24 to 29, and 8 were aged 30 to 36. And they were from all over Ireland. It's mad now to think that I was driving all over Ireland to do interviews, but I was, and it was so glorious and so lovely. And I did not appreciate how amazing it was to leave your county and not, be worried about many different things. So that was really lovely. And, you know, I met people in all kinds of places and had conversations in lots of different contexts. And it was a really lovely experience. It was probably my favorite part of the research process, was speaking to the people who shared their stories. Interestingly, the number of placements people had, and this may not come as a surprise to many of you, some people had one placement, some people had 21 placements, and some people had 21 placements and more, and weren't able to give a definitive number, which is obviously a notable point in and of itself. So there's a big range there in terms of the number of placements. And in terms of the type of placement that people had been in, 6 people had been only in foster care, 6 had been only in residential care. It's kind of a funny way that it split up so beautifully, so symmetrically for me there. But then 6 people had been in a mixture of foster care and residential care, and some people had also spent time in secure services, secure units, and a couple of people had spent time in hostels and hotels as well as that. So that's why I have that little plus sign, mixture of both plus, indicating the other contexts that people ended up staying in when they were in care. And there was a big range as well in terms of the age when people left school, from the youngest at 14 up to 18, up to 19. And I think it was about 5 people had left school early, but the other 13 had left school after their leaving cert. So just in terms of at the point of interviews, so I did my interviews between 2017 and 2018. I hope I have those years right. I'm pretty sure I do. I started recruiting in March, and I did about 18 months of recruiting and interviewing. So 7 of the people I spoke to had master's degrees, 1 person had a higher diploma, 6 had undergraduate degrees, 1 had a diploma, 2 had done post-leaving cert courses, and 1 had done the leaving certificate. So a range there in terms of the various pieces of education people had completed. And interestingly, pretty much everyone I spoke to had plans to go on and do more, except for the people who had done masters. There was a couple who wanted to go on and pursue further education beyond a masters, but of all the people I spoke to, they were very keen to pursue further education, and education was very much a feature of their lives, which maybe we can discuss at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to move on now to start talking about my findings. So this is not, as I said, it's very hard to, as I'm sure you can imagine, 18 stories lends itself to being, you know, hugely rich, detailed, complex data to then go and analyze. And there was so much in the data. And I reported things beyond what you're seeing here in my final thesis. But these are the things that I thought were particularly important for today to share with you guys for this presentation. And I'm going to talk in a little bit of detail about each of those. Okay, so the first finding there being this point that we should expect to see diversity in the educational pathways of people with care experience. And I'll speak to why that was a finding in a moment. Then we'll look at how the connections with key people can play a central role in influencing educational pathways and can be seen throughout a person's life, okay? And bearing in mind that the people I spoke to weren't old, in you know, the age of 36 is not old, it's old, I suppose. But even up to that point, there was many different influences and factors shaping people's pathways in terms of the role of other people. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how this idea of disruption or developmental wobbles in educational progress may be the norm for people with care experience, as it so often is for people without care experience. And I'll talk about that a little bit as well. And then just finally zoning in on this fact that there is this ongoing potential for new beginnings and opportunities in education, which I think is really apparent in my data. So without further ado, to tell you a little bit about this point around the fact that I think we should expect to see diversity in educational pathways of people with care experience. So when I analyze the data, if anyone is really keen to know how I analyze the data, please let me know, but I'm not going to go into that now. I think the findings are probably more interesting at this point. But I was able to see, broadly speaking, now obviously, you know, compartmentalizing lives and stories is tricky, but when I looked at the various pathways that everyone I spoke to had taken, and I broke them down and I tried to group them, in a sense, I spotted these 4 pathways. So this typical pathway, the typical pathway plus, and short-term and long-term disrupted pathway. And I have those last 2 in bold because most people I spoke to followed those 2 pathways or had taken those 2 pathways. So just to give you a sense of what each of them looked like. So this typical pathway, and there were 3 people who fell under this category. So you have, it's fairly typical pathway, I suppose, or an expected pathway in many ways. I wonder it's not necessarily as typical as we think, but moving from primary school into secondary school and into higher education. And that was the experience of 3 people that I spoke to. And then for another 3 people, they had taken this typical pathway plus. So the plus being this extra year that you'll see there in the form of further education course. So these people that I spoke to had gone to primary school and then secondary school, and then immediately after secondary school had done a 1-year further education course and then gone straight into higher education. And for the 3 of those people, if I remember correctly, they hadn't been particularly pleased with their Leaving Cert results. So they had done this further education course as a kind of bridging exercise to then move into the various higher education courses that they wanted to pursue. So then So it was 3 people in the first group, 3 people in the next group, and 6 people in this group, and 6 people in the fourth group. So that's 12 people altogether had this short-term or long-term disrupted pathway. So in this group, there was primary school and then secondary school with some early school leavers in this group as well. And then a short period out of education for various reasons. Okay, so homelessness, addiction, people working, people parenting for their own children, and also sometimes caring for relatives and parents often. I should note that the first 2 boxes, I focused very much on what happened for people when they left school and were trying to pursue or what happened around their pursuit of further and higher education, just because primary school is a kind of neat little box. It doesn't mean it was always a straightforward experience. It's just not the thing that I'm zoning in on here. So this short period out of education ranged from months to about 3 years for people in this group. Okay. And then in the final group, you had these long-term disrupted pathways where there was a period in primary school, secondary school, and some early school leavers. And then in an extended period away from education for various reasons again. And in a couple of instances, people were planning to return to education and hadn't done that yet, but it was on the cards. But that this extended time away was spent doing various different things in various different roles, having various different life experiences. And as I said, it ranged from, or maybe I didn't say, this extended period was about 4 to 10 years. And in one instance, it was an ongoing period away from education with a planned return. So what I think this information tells us, and I'm always interested to hear what other people have to say about these things, but I would suggest that this gives us a more complete picture of the potential routes into and through further higher education. That idea that yes, some people take this fairly typical pathway, but a lot of people have an alternative pathway, and different things happen in our lives and in their lives, and then they get back on the education bus, as Robbie would say, a little bit later when they're ready. Okay, and I think it's really, really important to note the key role that further education played in the stories of so many of the people I spoke to. And that's something there's a little bit written about that in the literature, but I think it's really, really apparent how important that was as a bridging exercise and as a way of getting back into education for a lot of people that I spoke to. I think we also see the impact of the various roles that adult life brings in terms of being a parent, being a carer, being an employee, working, being a student, and sometimes holding those roles at the same time. If you're a parent and you go back into education, you probably don't stop being a parent. That's very much there, and how those roles interact and maybe complement each other sometimes, but also might make the experience a bit more tricky, at various junctures. And then the presence of transitions across all of those stories. So moving from maybe leaving school early to working, to being a parent, to getting back into education, and kind of acknowledging that the complexity of those transitions, that they were sometimes off time or out of sequence with what we might expect. That's a point that could be kind of pulled apart, I think, in some ways, but that there was multiple transitions present for a lot of the people that I spoke to is really important. And I think ultimately, these pathways suggest that we could really do with thinking about education and care in a more flexible way, I would suggest. And this idea of outcomes and educational outcomes where they're measured at one point in time doesn't really give us a great sense of where people could go. And I think for a lot of the people that I spoke to, if we had have looked at their educational outcome at at maybe 4 or 5 years before I spoke to them, it would have been a very different story, and it kind of really points to the value of taking that longer term perspective and having that look back over where people have been and how far they've come. So just moving on then to the second kind of big finding, I suppose, and this one's very much about the role of other people in influencing educational pathways, and the fact that that can be seen throughout a person's life. And I'm sure everybody here has got somebody or some people that they can think of that were really key and pivotal in terms of their own education, be it for good or bad, I suppose. And I suspect that those people may be present at different points in our lives, and it's no different for the people that I spoke to as well. So the 4 big points under this finding are the idea that opportunities for educational support are present across a person's life course. The idea that family, and I'll unpack that in a moment, is a central source of educational support. And really, I think a really interesting and important point in this from this study was this idea of intergenerational capacity for educational support, and the idea that relationships outside of the family are supportive of education. So just to zone in on the first one of those a little bit, if you look at this image, you can see the various people who are coming up as being particularly important in the educational journeys of the people that I spoke to. So in childhood and adolescence, it's not that surprising, I suppose, that maybe, for a lot of people, actually birth family was quite supportive. That wasn't always the case, but it was for many people. Carers, teachers, friends, professionals in school, as well as teachers, which I thought was really interesting and really important to acknowledge. And then as you move into early adulthood and adulthood more generally, you see the role of, lecturers, people's spouses becoming very, very influential. Lecturers I've already said, but work colleagues as well were mentioned a fair bit by various people that I spoke to. And I think that's really noteworthy as well, and looking and kind of speaks to the fact that these opportunities for support are present across the lifespan, across the life course. The idea of family being a central source of educational support, and I have family in inverted commas, I think family means different things to everybody, but particularly, I suppose, for the people that I spoke to, for some people, family was birth family. For some people, family was foster carers and foster family. And for some people, it was residential care staff. So very individual perspectives on that, which I think need to be honoured, obviously. And just a couple of things that people had to say, which I think really illustrate this point very nicely. So Amy, who was 25, said, I always felt that support from them, her foster carers, which was so vital. And they always told me that I was so smart and I could do this. Such a kind of profound message that I think many of us are very fortunate to receive, but I think it was really, Amy just articulated really well. And you could see how that message stayed with her over time over the course of the conversation that I had with her. And then Emily noting that the staff are always like, Emily, whatever you want to do, you can do it. It doesn't matter if it's hard, you'll get there, you'll do it. And that always stuck in my head. I was like, do you know what? I can do what I want to do. And Emily spoke so highly of the staff in the residential home that she had lived in, like incredibly highly of them. This point around intergenerational capacity for educational support, I think bears teasing out a little bit. So there was 2 layers to that. So the influence of people's own parents, so very often birth family for some of the people that I spoke to. And then also on the other side of that, the influence of actually becoming a parent and being a parent. So for Stephen, he spoke really beautifully about his mum. She always had a strong value system and belief in education. I think it's from her own upbringing as well. And she always wanted us to do well in it. She always pushed us, to do our best and encourage us. And if you see that he suspects that it's coming from her own upbringing, so that intergenerational capacity really playing out over time there. And then a lot of people that I spoke to were parents, and some had become parents and they were quite young. And interestingly, and I appreciate this might not be the case for everybody, but for most of the people that I spoke to, that had been a very positive, ultimately a positive in terms of their education, not necessarily straightforward, but very positive ultimately. So Grace then saying, if I didn't have her child, I would have never finished college. Like, I wouldn't have had any reason to stay. I suppose I felt that I needed to have something behind me because I was a mother now and I had to provide. And that sentiment was present in the ways that a lot of people spoke about their sense of being a parent, but also the idea of just wanting to be a good role model and motivate their child and show them how wonderful education could be, essentially. So I think that was a really powerful message to come out of the conversations. Then lastly, just to note that this idea that relationships beyond the family are supportive of education. And in many ways, a lot of this stuff is kind of intuitive and makes sense. But I always think it's useful to have evidence to kind of to back it up. So people here talking about friends and lecturers as being really important and pivotal, actually, in many ways, to these people's stories. So Claire, who's 26, saying that her friend would be a massive encouragement and a massive help in the last 4 years while she completed her degree. And even in terms of my confidence and positive thinking. So it's not just about practical things, but about kind of, you know, being there, being that reminder that, you know, you can do it. And then Terry, who was 25 when I spoke to him, talking about a particular lecturer saying that the woman believes in me more than I've ever believed in myself, repeatedly telling me since the first day I've met her. I think she has been, yeah, the absolute catalyst. I loved the use of the word catalyst, and I think it's really powerful. So just then I'm going to be done in about 5 minutes, I'd say 5 or 10 minutes. So you're coming to the end. Thank you for bearing with me. The next two findings, I'm not going to present quotes or anything to support them. They're more findings that I drew from the overall, when I looked at all of the findings that I had. These were kind of concluding findings, I suppose. And this one, I think, they're all important, obviously, but I really like this one a lot. So the idea of disruption and developmental wobbles in educational progress being the norm for many people with care experience. And it was very visible, these various things that had interrupted the educational pathways of the people that I spoke to. And arguably interrupted is the wrong word. It was just life happening, and education took a back seat for a while and then was returned to, you know, so the language around that is something to think about. But what I would suggest is, you know, that these should be considered a normative part of the developmental pathway of many people with care experience, as they so often are for young people who don't have care experience. You know, we think about things like gap years and taking time out, and I think we think about those in different ways for people who haven't been in care. Arguably, I'm always happy to be proven wrong on these things, but I think it's worth considering that, you know, this is the norm potentially, and how do we plan for that? How do we allow for that? How do we nurture that? You know, because often when we have these wobbles, I'm sure we can all relate to that point, that, you know, the things that we kind of do and that knock us off course can sometimes bring us back on course in a way that is much more helpful and appropriate than what we would have potentially been doing if we weren't knocked off course. So food for thought. And then my final finding, this idea that there's ongoing potential for new beginnings and opportunities in education. And I think if you look at the pathways of the people that I spoke to and the various points in their lives at which educational support was provided, I think that's really apparent. There's many routes into and through further and higher education. I should have written there, my apologies. And I think we know that in many ways, but I'm not sure that it's always, it's not necessarily, we can't always facilitate it, I suppose, for people who've been in care, young people who've been in care. And the idea of narratives of potential, and this is a Robbie-ism. I don't know if I should use that phrase, but Robbie that coined this term, this idea of narratives of potential. I should have his reference in there. I'm sorry about that. But the idea that narratives of potential are present in the educational pathways of people with care experience. And I think you can see that again. To me, that's very evident in the stories of the people that I spoke to. You know, that there was this potential that was returned to and tapped into at various points in time, sometimes by the person themselves, sometimes by people around them, sometimes by circumstance. And that there's alternative ways of conceptualizing educational outcomes for people with care experience. So not necessarily just as outcomes being finite endpoints, but that they're fluid, they're changing, they're dynamic, and they're lived. You know, it's a lived experience being a human being. And outcomes change from day to day. So thinking about how we conceptualize those outcomes. And I'm not saying that's easy, but I think it's something that maybe needs to be teased out a little bit. So I'm going to just spend a few minutes talking about some implications of the study in terms of policy and practice, and then just a few concluding thoughts, and then I'll be finished. So if you think back to the point I made about the Irish context, and this is not unique to Ireland, but that aftercare provision can be extended up to the age of 23 if someone is in full-time care or full-time education or accredited training. And I think that the data from, or the data from this study, and I'm aware that it's a small study, but it's a study nonetheless, and it's a study in the context of having very little information on this topic in Ireland. But policies in relation to the education of people with care experience arguably would be well placed to allow for and expect diversity in educational pathways. I think if you look at the group of people that I interviewed, they had really done incredible things in terms of education, and there was still this diversity, and this passage of time was necessary for many of them. And I think it's understandable to think, and this is documented, this is not new information that I'm kind of bestowing, but that those initial years after leaving care can, not always, but can be tricky years, and there can be a lot of things to figure out, and education isn't necessarily number one on the priority list. It is for some people, but it's not for others. And how can we kind of allow for that? Can we allow for that? And then the second point there ties very much into that, is the fact that extensions and aftercare support are contingent on the pursuit of full-time education, notably the full-time. Is that problematic? I would suggest that it maybe needs to be looked at. I think certainly based on what I have found, arguably it is in some ways. But again, this is kind of the first toe in the water on this topic and on this issue, or one of the first toes in the water, I should say. But I think this, if nothing else, this study certainly poses the question, is that working out? Is that beneficial? Is that to the best of everybody? Does that do its best by everybody, And should we strive for aftercare policies that seek to support and nurture the pursuit of education in a more flexible way? And I think that's an important question to consider as well. I would suggest that the answer is probably yes, but I realize that from a policy perspective, that is not necessarily an easy thing to do. But I think these are maybe tough questions that need to be put out into the ether. And again, following on from that aftercare policies that maybe allow for these developmental wobbles and anticipate and consider these as developmental opportunities, which, very often they are, not always, but very often there is usually an opportunity in there somewhere, but that we can kind of allow for it, consider it, factor it in, and nurture it, and give a young person the space that they maybe need to figure out what the opportunity was within that. Lofty goals, I know, but I figure if I don't put them out there, they won't go out there. And then lastly, just a couple of points for practice, just to consider in terms of practice. So this idea that there is the continued capacity for new beginnings and change. And I think that's something that is very intuitive and probably resonates for a lot of people. But I think having that constant reminder that there is this capacity, and that sourcing people or spotting people along the way in a person's journey to support their education can be done across the life course, and also might come from unexpected places or less expected places. The second point there speaks to a point that one of my findings that I haven't shared here today, but it's related to the role of agency and young people's own agency in influencing their own educational pathway, which was a big theme within the study, and one that I felt like I wouldn't be able to do justice to in the time that I had today. But I think it's worth noting the importance of being attuned to the impact of an individual person's actions, but also noting the constraining nature of the structural factors that they might be limited by, So for example, one of the young people I spoke to, one of the adults that I spoke to, this is not an unusual story, I suppose, but he had to leave his residential care home in his leaving cert year, and that had a knock-on effect. He wanted to do his exams and he wanted to do really well, but he was, wildly impacted by his living circumstances at that stage and moving into his own apartment and things. And that was a tough one for him at the time. And then lastly, the importance of opening up spaces to engage people with care experience with potential key actors, so, and this is something that Robbie has written about as well, the importance of they don't necessarily have to be education people, but creating opportunities for people to meet and engage with and gain support from various potential key actors, be they foster carers or sports coaches or anything like that. So lastly, just a concluding comment here, that I think the study findings suggest that we do, if we could possibly think, we need to think a bit more flexibly in terms of the policies and the ways we think about educational outcomes when we're looking at the issue of the educational progress and attainment of people with care experience. I think this study really highlights the need for flexibility and the need to kind of maybe look at what we're doing and how that fits with the lived experience of people who have been in care. And that's just something to kind of think about, I suppose. And then, you know, we're very, I think lifelong learning is something that's talked about a lot in, you know, everyday life, and it's held up as a very positive endeavor and something we should strive for. And I would suggest that the findings of this study suggest that we would do well to consider the education of people with care experience from a lifelong and ongoing perspective. And I don't know if you can read that, but that's a quote from Michelangelo at 87. I'm still learning. So just lastly, then, I just really wanted to thank the 18 people who shared their stories and experiences with me so openly and honestly. You know, it was a real joy to meet with them and speak with them and hear their stories. And the study literally would not have been possible without them. So just to say thank you to everybody for that. There are some references if anyone wants to read any of the journal articles or my entire PhD thesis, if someone's at a loose end for a day, you can find them all here. But also, I think I'll just leave my email address up maybe there for a few minutes, so you can email me in relation to the study, but also, as Robbie said at the beginning, email me in relation to getting added to the mailing list for future presentations like this. So that is me. I will stop talking. I'll hand back to Robbie for a moment.
Okay, Eavan, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent, excellent. It's always reassuring to be heard.
I know.
Especially when you're live with 65 people or something like that listening.
I know. No pressure.
Exactly. So thank you very much. I think that was a really stimulating presentation. Lots of food for thought. And I know that we have some questions, so maybe I can go to the questions on, and we welcome more, obviously.
Perfect.
So the first one, I'm going to read out the questions for the benefit of the audience and for you, of course, Eavan, to give you a chance.
Yeah, thanks. Hope I can answer them.
Okay, so the first question, the comment from Neil Forsyth is that this is a very interesting study. And he says, out of curiosity, what areas of study were pursued by those who went on to third level?
Great question. Hi, Neil. Thanks for the question. So interestingly, a lot of people I spoke to were pursuing or hoping to pursue careers in the social care and social work field. Some people had gone into education, some had gone into kind of marketing and business side of things, but there was a very definite weighting towards social care and social work courses for sure, which I think is an interesting point in and of itself. But yes.
Okay, thanks, Eavan. That's great. Next question from Sarah Morrissey. Hi, Eavan. Great presentation. I'm currently managing a learning centre for students, 12 to 16-year-olds. 20% of the student group are young people in care or currently supported by social work. Did your study come across the aspect of control for the young people in care in terms of their attendance at school? And if so, was there any guidance on this, on how this could be supported?
Thanks, Sarah. So if I understand the question, this is where it would be really nice if I could like ask you some questions about your question in a way, but we're in a webinar world. I think you're wondering about whether people spoke about how much enforcement there was, maybe for want of a better word, around them actually being at school. And it certainly came up. There was a couple of people who spoke about periods when they didn't attend school. And to be totally honest, there wasn't much enforcement around that. Now, this is only the people I spoke to, and I'm not suggesting that's necessarily the case everywhere or now or anything like that. But for the people I spoke to who didn't attend, mostly it went relatively uncommented on. And one person in particular missed 2 full years of her secondary school year, and nobody noticed it. So there was no guidance specifically coming out of that. There were people who had experiences where, you know, there was a teacher who was kind of saying, you know, if you don't come in, like, you have to come in, you just have to come in. Like, but it was very, it wasn't guidance. It was kind of one person, again, taking an interest in an initiative and encouraging someone, letting the person know that they were expected to be in school and they were believed in that they could be in school. So that's a bit of a wishy-washy answer, but I suppose in summary, it did come up. Mostly it was the people were kind of left to their own devices, and no specific guidance really. I mean, I got the sense that people would have appreciated if someone had have commented on it or had have kind of expressed an interest in the fact that they weren't there, you know. So yeah, I'm sorry, that's not probably the news you were hoping to hear. So my apologies.
Okay, thanks, Eavan. Very interesting issue. The next question is again from Neil Forsyth, and it's more probably in the nature of a comment or an observation, and in some ways it speaks to that issue about the nature of the sample, and that there's certainly a lot of evidence that there are different groupings within the care or former care population. So Neil's just drawing attention to that point. He's saying there is this is a comment on existing policy or the logic of policy. There is a perverse incentive in existing policy that pushes young people towards education because of a significant financial reward. In other words, you qualify for certain financial and other support potentially if you are in full-time education or training. You've made that point yourself, Eavan, already. This can lead, Neil's point is, this can lead to poor educational choices and poor outcomes if the young person is really driven completely by the money rather than by the educational choices or preferences or interests. So he's saying, again, care leavers are forced to make critical decisions about their lives that ignore their developmental needs. I think that speaks to your point about being more flexible about timing. Sorry, I don't want to cut across your answer.
No, you're totally right. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I totally agree, Neil. And I think that was very apparent. Your point is well made and well taken. You know, I agree that it can lead to poor or rushed choices and not necessarily the pursuit of education for furthering a career or furthering, you know, life chances and interest and all that kind of thing. But kind of because I need to keep service or I need to keep the financial support, I'll do this course and this course. And yeah, I totally agree. Care leavers forced to make critical decisions about their lives that ignore their developmental needs, but also maybe ignore, you know, their age and their experiences in that moment and prior to that moment. And the fact that it doesn't necessarily have to happen in that window of time, I think that's something that we are not necessarily very good. So it's definitely a culture of like, do secondary school, do university, but I think there's an allowance of returning to education and in the wider population, maybe in a way that we don't necessarily allow for people who are leaving care. So I agree. Don't have any profound insights, but I totally agree, Neil. Thanks.
Okay, I'm just going to deal with a point that's raised, which is relevant for the whole audience. I mean, I know every question is relevant for the whole audience, but this is a point just from Ellen O'Sullivan. She says, "Hi, Eavan, thank you for the great presentation with very interesting findings. Just curious, will this be made public in the hope of maybe making some positive changes currently for people in care?" So I suppose that this is this actual event, but also maybe the work you're doing to promote the findings.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. That's a super question. And yeah, I mean, so the link to this recording will be made publicly available, but I'm also, I in May, this is like desperate, it's November, but I have been putting together kind of a briefing summary on my PhD that is not the entire thesis, because I think it's not realistic to think that people would read that. And the journal articles that are out there, but they're in journals that, you know, if you're connected to a university, you can access them, but they're not always easy to access. But yeah, certainly the next step in terms of my plan is to finalize the summary or the briefing on the study and share it, you know, with, you know, key stakeholders in the area. I do think my study is like the first of several studies that needs to be done on this area, and, you know, hopefully I can, me and Robbie maybe can do something on that, but I definitely want to make the findings available in an accessible way, but obviously then if people want to find out more, they can. So watch this space for the briefing summary. You're giving me a renewed reminder and impetus to finish it, Ellen, so thank you for that.
Thanks, Eavan. Okay, Mary Fahy saying excellent presentation. Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Mary.
Emer wrote saying, would it be beneficial to extend care to 21 as they have done in Australia, and actually in other places in many of the states in the US have done it, and some parts of the UK. So this is extending care to 21, where young people can remain in care voluntarily after 18, so where the law actually provides for that.
Yeah.
It's different from aftercare. It's more 100% support, and that this would also mean that young people would get better financial assistance for educational support and so on, and other support. So that's a really interesting point, Emer.
Yeah, you probably have thoughts on this as well, Robbie. I'd say I might dive in first, because I think, Emer, it's such an interesting point. And as you say, Robbie, it's about extending care, and then by default, is there an extension to aftercare supports and things? And I think it would be very beneficial to do that and to explore it and to try it out here. But I do think there's also something about some of the people I spoke to were in their early 30s before they went back to education. And I appreciate that there's other financial supports out there for returning to education for some people. But part of me thinks that, if you've been a child who's been in care, you're a child of the state, and this is the kind of stating the obvious again, but once you turn 18 or 21, whichever the age, you were still a child of the state. So arguably, extending care to 21 is a brilliant starting point. But, what about financial and educational supports down the line, the further down the line? If someone decides when they're 40, they want to go back into education and they have been in care and they are, don't have any other means for doing it, is there a role for the state to play in supporting that? So, but to answer your question, I think it potentially would be very beneficial. And I think, yeah, as you say, Robbie, it's happening in other jurisdictions outside of Australia as well. I'm not sure if there's any research done on the impact of it. I think Mark Courtney has done a little bit. It does seem to be beneficial in terms of education in one sense, does it, Robbie? Can you remember?
Yes, well, I think overall there are benefits. There's a paper which I've been involved with, is just published which looks at progress on implementing extended care and what the evidence is on its effects so far, looking across 10 countries. And it's if anyone wants information about that paper, I'm happy to, if they email me, I'll robbie.gilligan@tcd.ie. I'll send you a copy of the paper. So the Lisa Garvin, a nice message, and remembering that educational journeys proceed at different paces.
Yay!
Lisa remembering that she was at the first Children in Care Research Forum at the beginning of her own PhD, and she's so impressed that you are now finished.
Lisa, you're nearly there. I'm sure of it. I'm sure you're there. You'll get there.
So best of luck on that.
And thanks for coming.
Well, of course, Eavan was a bit further down the road, I suppose, if she was already speaking at the event. So, in fairness to you, Lisa.
Exactly.
So Danielle Douglas saying, great presentations. Thanks so much, Eavan. Just wondering if any of the participants commented on how care experiences impacted on their learner identities in terms of self-confidence, expectations, etc. Very interesting question.
Such a good question, Danielle. And hi, thanks for coming. You're such a star. Yeah, I mean, God, that I feel like I could have a long conversation about that. Yes is the answer. It was commented on, not necessarily in those terms, I suppose. And I can think of a few examples, but one person in particular who had a very sort of relatively difficult and reasonably chaotic first kind of 7 or 8 years of life, and then moved into a foster home where before that point education had been discussed in very different terms, if at all, in the context in which she was living. And then when she went into her foster home, the expectations were huge. And the school she went to, within the school there was a huge culture of educational the pursuit of education and academics and all that kind of thing. And she very much pointed to the fact that this was changed her perspective on education and pointed her in a direction that she otherwise would not have gone to. She always had this sense that she was quite an able person, but thinking about that idea of learner identity, it's almost like the context lined up with her sense of herself, I suppose. So she was given the space, and the expectation was very much within her foster family that like you'd go to school and then you go to university, and that's what she did. And that was true of a lot of people. But interestingly as well, it also had the opposite effect, where people had very negative experiences in care in terms of their lack of encouragement or kind of outright discouragement, I suppose, in terms of education. And that had its own impact. And I think interestingly for the people I spoke to, they were ultimately able to turn that around as a motivation for education, but I think that's a very dangerous thing to be thinking that is what happens always, because obviously it can have quite the opposite effect and really stay with people. So yes, they did, and you're making me think maybe there's something to write about this from this paper as well. So maybe we can chat about that, Danielle, I don't know. But yeah, it's a great question, and it's probably one that'll be stewing in my mind after this, and I'll think of loads of things that I should have said. But that one person, I think kind of that example captures that in a way, I think, that the experience of coming into care, and specifically this foster home that she ended up staying in for a long time, and that is now her family, having that big impact. Anyway, sorry, I'm waffling on, Robbie, sorry. But thank you, Danielle.
Okay, well, we have some more questions, so maybe we can try and aim for shorter answers.
I'll try. Note to self.
Sharon Fogarty saying, excellent presentation. Thanks, Eavan and Robbie. Deirdre McCormick saying, great presentation. Julie Cal saying, great presentation, Eavan. I have been concerned in practice that some of the most vulnerable young people have such a desire to break their connection to social work at 18 that they walk away from support without maybe fully understanding the implications of this. For example, losing financial and professional support. Did you find any evidence of this? I fully agree with your thoughts about the need to allow developmental breaks.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to try and give a short answer here, Julie, because I'm just, so yes, is the answer. And it's interesting because two people are coming to mind who spoke about this, about like, you know, having no interest in engaging with aftercare supports, and really has been like, what is that? I don't even want to know. It's another person in my life. But actually both of those people's foster carers were kind of rigid on it and made them meet with an aftercare worker. And ultimately that they were like, oh, this is actually really helpful. So, I mean, that was the role of the foster carer in kind of navigating that with them. But certainly for a couple of people, there was I just want nothing to do with this anymore. The sooner I can get away from it, the better. And then realizing the implications of that after the fact. Sometimes one person realized the implications of it just before she could contact and got back on the bus, as you would say, Robbie. But yeah, a really interesting question, Julie. Thank you. Another one I'll probably think about after this. Sorry, that was too long of an answer, Robbie.
Well, it was shorter. Alan Hayes saying, thanks, Eavan. I'm looking forward to reading more about your study. Were there any findings or recommendations regarding what specific supports would have been beneficial to children with care experience when identifying their direction of study? So it's kind of, I think, kind of a career guidance. Yes, you access that the right kind of career guidance, if I understand the question.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, Alan. No, it's not something that I actually looked at specifically, but certainly some people had very helpful people in their lives guiding them. Some people didn't and kind of fell into a course, and social care, social work often just felt like the one that they knew for a lot of, for not a lot of people, for some people. So no, but something to go back and look at my data for, because that is a really interesting point, and something myself and Robbie, I think the Releasing Potential series kind of speaks to that a little bit, Robbie, as well. But thank you, Alan. I'll go back and look at that. If you want to email me with any other questions, you can.
Question from Jonathan Linklater, who identifies himself as a speech and language therapist. Thanks, Eavan. Great to hear the different perspectives. Did any of the participants reflect on barriers or difficulties they experienced, such as around access to services such as speech and language, occupational therapy, educational psychology support?
Amazing question. Thanks, Jonathan. I feel like I've probably met you at a previous research forum, Jonathan. A really quick answer to that comes to mind is, a lot of people I spoke to were diagnosed with dyslexia. Some people had that diagnosis made very early. Some people were actually in college before the diagnosis was made. And that, as you can imagine, had various impacts in their educational pathways or journeys over time. So I'm not necessarily speaking to the barrier in terms of engaging with the service, but more noting that there was a reason to be engaged with services, and sometimes that didn't happen until quite later, which presented as its own barrier. I hope that makes sense and is a reasonable response.
Very good, thank you. Danielle, coming back again, so interesting your response to her earlier point. Thanks for answering so clearly, and well done for inspiring those of us who are close to finishing.
Can't wait to hear when you finish, Danielle.
Good luck, Danielle. Ellen O'Sullivan back in it saying, through your research after meeting so many care leavers, do you think if there was more psychological supports for young people that it would transition better for they would make better progress educationally?
Ellen, that's such a good question, and kind of probably tied into to Jonathan's question in one sense, I suppose, that in terms of the very practical realities of diagnosing if there is a learning difficulty there and getting appropriate support for that. I think that certainly would be very valuable. And I suppose psychological supports can also, I suppose, be kind of in a therapeutic sense. And I don't know, I think that would be, if that was offered, and I know that is offered in many contexts, that could potentially impact on education progression. But again, I suppose that idea that maybe it being available in a more open way, that people don't necessarily have to engage with it in, X window, but that it's an option to go back to. I think, like education, there's something about the timing of that kind of endeavor and seeking that kind of support that needs to be a little bit flexible as well. But I think ultimately I imagine that would make a big difference to a lot of people, not to everybody, but to a lot of people. Thanks, Ellen.
And I just maybe add a comment that I think when we look at the Irish approach to education, lifelong education, I'd have to say it compares pretty favorably with what I hear is happening in some other countries. So our system tends to be is becoming more flexible and welcoming and facilitative of people getting back on the education bus, as I like to say. So, but it is a very important point about, are we providing the right kinds of formal supports? But of course, you also in your study, I think, Eavan, identified how important informal support is. A wide range of people can play an important part. And they're not all people with jobs with education in the title, or even formal jobs. They may be, people who are friends or they're not playing a formal role in the person's life, and yet they had a big part in the story.
Exactly.
Susan Flynn thanking Eavan. I've learned so much. Thanks, Susan, a colleague of ours in the School of Social Work and Social Policy. Rainer Buckley saying, great presentation, Eavan.
Thanks, Rainer.
Yukon Shen saying, Yukon Shen, great presentation, very thought-provoking. Thank you, Eavan and Robbie. The COVID crisis we've experienced could potentially be a significant wobble for the school-age generation now, especially the ones receiving or having received care. I'd love to know how your participant group views the wobbles they've lived through, or are still sort of carrying along with them. That's a really interesting point. Do they take it to some extent as kind of educational for their self-growth as well? Are there positives in some of the difficult experiences, I think, is behind that point, which is a really interesting idea. How did these wobbles influence their choice of going or not going back to an educational institution for school education? Maybe you've covered a lot of these points in your publication. Says she'll go back and read them first, grinning.
Amazing. I think, I think actually the paper on agency, I think, speaks to a fair bit of those questions, because I think you're right. They were very often opportunities for growth that were not necessarily apparent in the moment, but with the passage of time, you could see how the opportunity that was inherent within a difficulty came to life. But also sometimes things were just difficult, and they were difficult, and that was that. So I would say maybe have a look at the paper on agency if you're able to, and if you can't access it, email me, and then I think that will answer some of those questions. Sorry, I'm trying to do short answers.
Okay, well done, Eavan. Well done. So this is the last comment. Janice Ryan, fantastic presentation. Having worked with young people in special care for 14 years, I love seeing young people gain an educational achievement and positive growth in life. So yes, I think that's a great note on which to end.
Perfect note to end on. Thanks, Janice.
Okay, well look, well done to everyone. Well done to Eavan, particularly for a great presentation and for such clear and full answers to the questions. I'm going to just remind you all about the email if you want to be included in the invitations to the next event, which we fully expect to be online, bearing in mind how things are. We do hope to get back to physical meeting at some point. So Brady E, BRADYE at tcd.ie.
Sorry, Robbie, it's Brady E3. No, you're okay. Brady E3, the number 3 at tcd.ie. If you even just Google Eavan Brady TCD, you'll find me. So
the one thing you should not do is give out the wrong email address.
I don't know who has Brady E at tcd.ie.
Right, I hope they don't get too many queries.
I'm sure
Brady E3.
At tcd.ie. Thanks, Robbie.
Okay. And there was a hand up from somebody there. Deirdre McCormack, was it? Am I right?
Yes, but I don't know how to.
That's gone. Sorry, it came up on the screen, but I can't trace it right now. My tricks, there, maybe. So the last comment is Jonathan Linklater. Thanks, Eavan. That answer tied in especially retiming to access. And yes, we met at the Children in Care Forum before. Thanks to Robbie for facilitating too. Okay, well, listen, folks, we try to stay on time. Try and do it within an hour. I think it's a good format to give people an intensive 1 hour opportunity, kind of a deep dive into an issue like this, which I think has been very, very stimulating, and hopefully encourages people to go off and think about ways in which education and care can align better and open up opportunities for people when they're ready, not when the system is ready, but when they're ready.
Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, Eavan.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Maeve.
Thank you, Maeve.
Bye,
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.